problem of higher level government control over a variety of disaster sites that might be occurring at a single moment. So for instance, in California, a couple of years ago, there were 12 major forest fires occurring simultaneously in the southern part of the state, from Los Angeles south to the Mexican border. 12 huge fires, each of which might have had 5,000 to 8,000 firefighters and all sorts of equipment and resources. Equipment was there was too little equipment, too few personnel. They had to decide where the need was greatest, where to deploy people. They had to make very tough decisions like, do we decide to let certain things burn because we're going to use personnel in one place, or don't we? There were huge political implications to this, and the need for having a system that can operate emergencies one level up. I would imagine that this was faced in the tsunami as well, because it covered such a wide geographic area. The question is, where do you deploy the limited resources you have, and where don't you? If you don't have an organizational system for doing that, you have to invent it on the spot. You'll argue. There will be lots of arguments and disputes. There will be political criticism of the opposition party or parties, and you can wind up with a horrendous mess, politically and operationally. You can't clear that up entirely, but you can make it somewhat better. This IMS system has now been extended to a range of other kinds of emergencies, hospitals, earthquakes, hostage takings, power blackouts, and it's been used pretty successfully where people are well trained on it. And starting in 2002, the U.S. Congress passed a law that said all emergency management professions have to use this system. We're still in the process of deploying it and building up skills, and that's going to take at least a decade to do well, but it is a process that has already started. Yes?
Yeah, I just want to have a clarification. So in this system, you have different templates for different kind of disaster.
A different template?
Yeah.
No, there is an all hazards template.
Oh, all hazards.
It's a generalized template. There might be annexes, specialized elements of it because of the need. So for instance, in an earthquake, say you're comparing a forest fire with an earthquake. In an earthquake setting, you may need more helicopters for rescue than you would in a forest fire. So there's some details of it that would be different, but the basic organization is the same no matter what kind of disaster.
Thank you.
One other element that I alluded to just now in describing that Southern California dispute, and again, I should say, by the way, that one area where we haven't been completely successful with implementing this system is the relationship between the U.S. military and the civilian sector, because the military uses a different frame for managing its personnel, and there hasn't been sufficient coordination between the two. And last weekend, I was in Beijing attending first an international conference and then participating in strategic planning for their new National Institute of Emergency Management. And at the conference, there was a presentation by a senior officer of the People's Liberation Army who alluded to a fact that I've heard the civilian side say too, which is that the interface between the PLA, which is a very important component in response to civil disasters, and the civilian forces is much weaker than it ought to be, that they lack a common operating system. And indeed, there isn't even a completely common operating system in the civilian sector in China either. So that's an issue that they are gradually realizing and are starting to talk about ways of addressing, but have not done yet. My fifth core problem is the question of operational leadership versus policy leadership. And let me just put it, in a way, and I don't know how this problem presents in Indonesia at all, so I leave it to you to decide whether this applies. What I'm going to describe, and it plays out quite differently in China as well. But let me describe the U.S. system, which, because we're a democracy with separately elected officials who aren't all part of the same party system as in China, you may have some similarities to the problems the U.S. has. we have professional response leaders and we have political leaders. And the political leaders represent specific constituencies. They're elected, in our case, our congressional leaders, and most of the legislators at this, I think in every case, state legislators are elected to districts. So their first responsibility is to their district and their constituents. They have a parochial view because of that territorial responsibility. And the purview of an elected legislator is different from that of the president, who runs for office, or the governor of a state, who runs for office with for the entire constituency of that state, or even of a city, where, say, in New York, the mayor of New York has a different perspective than the elected council members of his city council. Political leaders and professional leaders in an emergency may clash, because the political leaders think they need to be out in front of the public. Sometimes they think they need to appear to be in charge, and yet they usually lack the skills to do it. They certainly lack the experience to do it. And in many cases, there is, even in relatively short disasters, there can be conflict between political leaders and others. Some political leaders are wise enough to take a back seat in running the professional side. They may have a public relations side, but they leave decision-making to professional firefighters or police officers or whoever in an emergency setting. But think about situations that aren't over quickly, that don't get resolved in 1 day or 2 days or even a week. Think of situations that drag on for weeks and weeks or even months. Certainly the tsunami must have been such a situation. Indeed, it probably has dragged on for years. In terms of the differences between professional leaders and political leaders may be greater. Professionals often think they're the experts, and indeed they have expertise, and they want to be in charge. Political leaders also think that they should be in charge, and they regard themselves as having legitimacy to make decisions. That's what they got elected for. And yet they may not know a lot about what they should be doing in an emergency. Each of these sides, each of these roles brings great strength potentially brings great strength to the situation. Professionals have their experience, they have their training, they know how to lead response organizations, they have relationships that are typically built up over multiple years with other responders, and they're prepared for dealing with many of the professional demands. On the other hand, political leaders also have skills. They are people who have acquired skill in communicating with the public. They are people who have greater senses, say, than a police chief about what members of the public are thinking. They know how to create coalitions. They're not in a hierarchical situation. They bargain all the time. They know how to reach compromises and how to find a way of balancing interests that seem to be competing, seem to be contradictory, but they can find a way sometimes to balance those out. And finally, political leaders are the people who can rally a community, get them to provide support, get them to improve their spirits, and most importantly, get them to move on from their losses, to accept their losses and understand it. I cannot imagine what it must have been like in Indonesia to deal with the national tragedy and the sadness that couldn't have missed any family or any community in the entire country that occurred after the tsunami.